Okay, bonjour and welcome to today's webinar, Building Adaptation Skills for Water Management. This webinar is the fourth of 7 that comprise a Building Adaptation Skills for a Changing Climate webinar series. You can see on the next slide, please. So this fall series shares experiences on how to build climate change adaptation skills. My name is Dominique Auger, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. I'm a policy analyst at Natural Resources Canada in the Climate Change Impact and Adaptation Division. Avant de poursuivre, je tiens à souligner que je suis située dans la ville de Québec, où les territoires traditionnels et de traités de plusieurs Premières Nations se rencontrent, dont le territoire de la nation Huron-Wendat. I also recognize that we're all working in a different place, and therefore you may be working on another Indigenous territory, and I encourage you to take a moment to reflect on that. The webinar today is made possible with funding support from Natural Resources Canada through the Canada Climate Change Adaptation Platform and the Building Regional Adaptation Capacity and Expertise Program, better known as BRACE. BRACE was a 5-year program funded under the Pan-Canadian Framework that wrapped up in March 2022. It funded 20 projects across several teams to increase capacity of organization, professionals, communities, and businesses to adapt. We'll add the link in the chat of the BRACE webpage and the resource library so that you can find the list of the BRACE projects and some results. So the webinar series features work done on the BRACE, but also other related initiatives. Next slide, please. Oh, we can stay on this one, sorry, for a few seconds. Just mentioning that the two first webinars were focused on building capacity of engineers and planners, while the third one looked at upscaling the workforce through cross-sectoral training and guided by competency framework and micro-credentials. So next slide, please. So you have some information here on the BRACE program, and feel free to have a look at the BRACE webpage, as I mentioned a bit earlier, to get additional information. So today you'll hear from speakers who focus their efforts on the water aspect of adaptation, specifically through agricultural water management, drought response plans, and municipal water and wastewater infrastructure. Next slide, please. So you see the 3 presentations here and the name of the 3 presenters. We'll get back to it a bit later. But before, a few technical information. Claire Sanders from the Climate Risk Institute is your technical support person for today's webinar, and she's available if you run into audio or technical issues. You can click on the chat box and find her name in a drop-down menu of participants to send her a direct message. Please note that your microphones have been automatically muted to avoid any audio distraction or feedback during the webinar. There is a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the webinar, but that doesn't mean that you have to hold your question until then. Please feel free to type out your question during the presentation in the Q&A box. And there's also a chat box if you would like to submit comments. Notez que le webinaire aujourd'hui est en anglais seulement, mais sentez-vous bien à l'aise de poser les questions en français. We are recording the webinar today, and we will be sending out a link to everyone who has registered, along with a copy of the presentation slides after the webinar. So on behalf of everyone joining us, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our 4 speakers today: Heather Davies, Doug Johnson, Lindsay Bolton, and Amy Winchester. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Heather Davies, who will talk about building adaptation skills to improve agricultural water management. So Heather works for the Saskatchewan Water Security Agency as the external quality specialist in the program advancement unit. She's part of a team that is tasked with developing policy, procedures, and research to continue to improve and promote Saskatchewan's approach to responsible agricultural water management, supporting a resilient and thriving Saskatchewan. So Heather, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thanks, Dominique. Good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to share with you what we've done in Saskatchewan with respect to the Ag Water Management BRACE project and our approach to ag water management capacity building to achieve climate resiliency. But before I go into that, I'm going to talk a little bit about who the Water Security Agency is. So next slide, please. The Water Security Agency is a Treasury Board Crown corporation It is kind of a unique organization across Canada in the sense we bring together a number of government's core water management and regulatory responsibilities. We're responsible for managing the province's water supply, protecting water quality, ensuring safe drinking water, and as well as the treatment of wastewater, managing dams and related water supply channels, reducing flood and drought damage, and protecting aquatic habitat and providing information about water. So we have a lot of different water-related issues that we address. And then maybe before I do that, before I go into the project a little more, I'm going to talk a little bit about the vision of Saskatchewan's agriculture water management strategy. So next slide, please. So Water Security Agency's Ag Water Management Strategy is responsible agriculture water management supporting a resilient and thriving Saskatchewan. So the intent of this strategy is to find a balance designed to support sustainable agriculture while considering environmental impacts and community relationships, including that neighbor to neighbor impacts associated with flooding and just good water management. We're kind of doing this by supporting the ag community, helping them guide through the effective water management techniques, and then good water management practices consider how agriculture can adapt to climate change, and adaptive water management practices, including responsible drainage, can help protect crops while at the same time reducing downstream flooding and increasing production. So next slide, please. So this BRACE project was involved in the development and delivery of 2 educational programs to assist agriculture producers in improving agriculture water management on the landscape. And so these 2 educational programs aim to help producers maximize yields or increase production at the same time withstanding those extreme events. So before I go into the programs, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the information we garnered from a survey that we developed. And we used that information to actually develop the education materials. So first of all, we contracted Park Prairie Adaptation Research Collaborative to look at some climate models for us and provide us with information. And what we found is that as well as through the Prairie Provinces chapter from the Changing Climate Regional Perspectives report, that Saskatchewan producers will likely face more extreme weather events. We're going to see more flooding and more drought across the prairies. And this figure here on the screen is within that chapter, Prairie Provinces chapter. And it associated primarily with property insurance claims. And you can see a number of different claims that have happened over the last few years. So I actually want to look a little bit further into this in regards to how the extreme weather might be affecting agriculture. So I took a look at Saskatchewan's crop insurance program, and I looked at their annual report. Last year in 2021, Saskatchewan experienced a very large drought. And what I did find in their annual report last year was that the liability in 2021-22 was the highest in the program's history at 8.5 billion. And 2021 actually had a record high of over $2.5 billion that were paid out to producers in regards to that drought. And I think another interesting fact about 2021 drought is, and Doug's going to show you this in the next presentation, that the drought Saskatchewan experienced in the spring and summer of 2021 was actually worse than the drought that was experienced across the prairies back in the 30s. But ag producers and productions was nowhere near affected as they were in the 30s. And that's because of the innovative agricultural best management practices that producers are adopting and implementing, such as no-till direct seeding. So these practices are helping producers weather the storm and be more resilient to extreme events such as drought and flooding. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, before we developed the education materials, we actually did a survey. So we contracted Insightrix to complete a multi-phase research project to measure producers' awareness and knowledge about a number of topics, including climate change, Saskatchewan's ag water management strategy, and the requirement to bring all drainage works into to be approved into compliance. So we focused our efforts with this survey on the highest risk regions of the province, mainly across the eastern portion of Saskatchewan. And the multi-phase research used a blend of qualitative focus groups as well as quantitative polling. So we had 3 different focus groups as well as a number of different polls through telephone as well as online polls. So next slide, please. And so here's kind of a look at some of the climate change related information we gathered during this multi-phase research. This slide shows the response received when we asked producers how important was the issue of climate change to you personally. Farmers' responses were divided on how important the issue was. Perceived importance of climate change generally decreased with age. So what we found is approximately 63% of producers between 18 and 23 believe that climate change is quite important to them, whereas only 45% of producers aged 55 and over believe that climate change is important to them. Next slide, please. And so then we asked producers if they think climate change is something that is affecting them and their their farming operations. And nearly 1/2 of producers interviewed responded that they believe that climate change is currently impacting them, or it will be something that will impact them in the future. And once again, older farmers were more skeptical in regards to the results of that, or as far as climate change go. So next slide, please. So some of the findings from the survey indicate the awareness of WSA and its ag water management regulations were modest. That was one of the questions we did ask respondents of the research, and only 1/3 of respondents actually indicated that they were aware of WSA's new legislation or that drainage projects actually needed to be approved. Most producers believe drainage has a significant impact on downstream farmers, but many are skeptical on the broader environmental impact and climate change issues associated with drainage. And many participants noted that in each area of the province, that they have unique challenges and different soils, etc., so that you can't kind of apply a consistent approach to all areas, that you'll need to look at different areas of the province to apply approaches. So next slide, please. Some of the recommendations included in order to encourage farmers to follow the proper approval process, WSA should be wary of using scientific information that points to causes of climate change, but rather focus on communicating direct impacts to farmers such as soil health, land stewardship, preparing for extreme events, and considering one's neighbors. The information gleaned from this survey was used to figure out what type of educational materials would be the most appropriate to help producers better understand climate change and how it may be projected to impact agriculture in the future in Saskatchewan. So as I mentioned earlier, this project was involved in the development of 2 different types of educational programs. So next slide, please. And the first program was called Ag H2 Onward, and it's a free workshop providing agriculture producers, rural municipalities, conservation and development area associations, watershed association boards, and other agricultural stakeholders with information about Saskatchewan agricultural water management strategy and how drainage works can be constructed to be more resilient to a changing climate, which will ultimately allow them to be more resilient by introducing them to innovative ag water management solutions. And the Ag H2 Onward workshop consisted of 5 different modules and 8 videos. And next slide, please. And as part of this project, Ag H2 Onward, we also developed a website, allowing producers to learn more about the workshop and to watch some of the 8 videos that were created. So the original plan was to deliver these workshops in person. However, COVID prevented us from doing so, and we moved these workshops to online virtual sessions through GoToWebinar. So we advertised and provided information about these workshops through stakeholders, through their member newsletters and magazines, presentations to some stakeholders, and we also handed out fact sheets and magnets with that information at different types of trade shows and targeted some advertisements through Saskatchewan Producers Facebook and Twitter. And these are all the different types of examples of infographics that we had used to promote Ag H2 Onward. Overall, Ag H2 Onward was delivered 35 different times between January 25th and 2021 and end of March 2022, 355 people were registered and 308 actually attended the workshops. Next slide, please. And so then the second educational program we developed was geared to developing a network of professionals called qualified persons who were there to support the producers in developing drainage works that were more resilient to climate change. So with this qualified persons program, it's a series of workshops that incorporate climate resiliency into ag water management. And so it consisted of 5 modules offered over 5 different morning sessions for a total of 15 hours. And the focus was on explaining how drainage works cause impacts to the environment and how we can reduce those impacts. So we looked at water quality, water quantity, habitat, soil erosion. And then the qualified persons training was delivered 10 times over 12 months, and 171 people took that course. And I'll just go to the next slide. And this is just a screen capture of some of the information about the Ag Water Management Capacity Building BRACE project that's on the map of Adaptations Actions webpage. So you can always go there to find out a little bit more about it. And next slide, please. And this just provides you a little bit more information about all of our different stakeholders here. So the Ag H200 and Qualified Persons Training is definitely a cost-shared initiative supported by Natural Resources Canada's BRACE program and the Water Security Agency, and in partnership with Ministry of Agriculture, Prairie Adaptation Research Collaborative, Prairie Water, Saskatchewan Conservation and Development Association, Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities, Saskatchewan Association of Watersheds, Association of Professional Engineers and Geoscientists of Saskatchewan, Saskatchewan Institute of Agrologists, and Technology Professionals of Saskatchewan. So we had quite a few different partners involved in these programs. And then next slide, please. And this just gives you the different URLs that you can go to find more information about both of these programs. So what we really are finding is that producers can be more resilient to climate change by looking at designing drainage works that consider the environmental impacts as well as downstream flooding. And that is it for my presentation.
Thank you very much, Heather. Very interesting. And at this point, I'm just checking if there is a clarification on the questions, and I don't see any. And again, there's going to be an open Q&A period at the end. So feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box. So I will now introduce our second presenter, who's also joining from Water Security Agency. So Doug Johnson. Doug is the Executive Director of Economic Development for the Water Security Agency. While working for WSA, he has been tasked with many roles and projects, including leading a team implementing Saskatchewan's new drainage regulation, as well as water management project at the municipal and provincial levels. Doug has also represented Saskatchewan on the International Souris River Board and on the Committee on Hydrology for the Prairie Provinces Water Board. So the water management project that Doug is going to talk about today relates to his role in developing drought response plans at the municipal and provincial levels. So over to you, Doug.
Yeah, thanks very much. I want to talk about building adaptation skills to improve the response of Saskatchewan communities to hydrologic drought. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the droughts we faced and why it's important for Saskatchewan communities to do this kind of work. Next slide, please. So one of the issues we have within Saskatchewan is many of the communities are not prepared for an extended drought. And that's going to be made much worse under a changing climate. So for people on this phone call may not understand, there's 4 different kinds of drought that we face as water managers. A meteorologic drought where there's an extended period of a little or no precipitation, whether it be snow or it be rain. It's a meteorologic drought. And it can lead into any of the other types of drought. An agricultural drought is usually where the soil and moisture conditions are so dry that we're not able to produce crops. In Saskatchewan, we also consider agricultural drought to be a situation where livestock don't have water to drink. The dugouts, the streams, the water bodies have dried up. So the livestock water supplies are threatened. Hydrologic drought, we consider it to be inadequate water supply for communities and for the environment. So it may be that the stream flows are minuscule or way down, or it could be that the water supplies in the water bodies, whether it be reservoirs, lakes, dugouts, whatever a community may be using, are impaired. There isn't enough water supply for a community, or the environment doesn't have enough water for its needs. And lastly, a socioeconomic drought, where each of the three other droughts has probably happened. It's affecting society in many different ways, and it's also having large economic impacts on say GDP or to a province or to a region. So socioeconomic drought is really the last, and I'll show some examples of that. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have had some fairly significant drought periods in Saskatchewan and in the Prairie provinces. People talk still about the 1930s drought, from 1929 to 1937. And there's some facts and folklore that I'd like to talk about. Some of it's real around drought, and some of it's other things. We had a fairly significant drought, actually Canada-wide, from 1999 through 2003. I'll talk about that really from a federal perspective or from a Canadian perspective. I'm not going to talk a lot about the 1987 to 1990 drought. It was a situation where it impacted much of southern Saskatchewan. Next slide, please. In the Prairie provinces, we are faced with variability. This is the annual precipitation for Swift Current. It's a major city in southwestern Saskatchewan, major for Saskatchewan. And you can see annual precipitation varying from about 600 millimeters down to different years where we have less than 200 millimeters of precipitation. So for people in the eastern part of Canada, you're seeing precipitation more typically in that, 500 to 1,000 millimeters of precipitation. Out here in the prairies, we'll see years where we see, on average 350 millimeters of precipitation for Swift Current. And one of the things I wanted to illustrate also is that the drought periods that I talked about, the 1930s, then period 1987 through 1990, 91, and the period around 2000s. This is what the precipitation was like at Swift Current. I also want you to note that period between 2016 to 2022, probably the driest period on record that we have. Remember, we only have 100 years of record here, a little bit more than that, but fairly significant. Next slide, please. This was percent of average precipitation in the Prairie provinces last year, October, ending in October 2021. You can see that much of the Prairie provinces had below normal precipitation, that's 60–85% of normal. But you can see the band between, starting in southern Alberta and stretching northeastward through Saskatchewan. We saw between 40 and 60% of the average annual precipitation. Manitoba also was under the grips. This looks much better for Manitoba at that time period, but that only kind of straightened up for Manitoba in that April to October period with fall precipitation. If we had looked at this a month earlier in September, August, in Manitoba, they probably would have been in a worse situation than Alberta and Saskatchewan were. with annual precipitation or average precipitation. Next slide, please. So talking about the 1930s, this is how it really evolved into a social economic drought in that time period. Between 1931 and 1936, 66,000 people left the Canadian prairies and went elsewhere. It's a huge movement of people outside of Saskatchewan, outside of the prairies. Per capita, annual per capita income in Saskatchewan fell from $478 a year to $135 in that 1933-34 period. So it's not only people leaving, but the economics of that. Wheat yields fell in the province in every year from 1928 to 1937. And this is the other part of this. There was $292 million of federal relief came to the prairie provinces. In today's dollars, that would have been $5.8 billion. And 61% of that went to Saskatchewan. So huge input from the federal government to help sustain people in the prairie provinces. Next slide, please. So some of the fact and some of the fallacy. Okay, there wasn't a drought for that entire period in the 1930s. There's a lot more going on. I mean, everybody knows about the market crash, the worldwide market crash in 1929 that sent countries into economic tailspins. We had a drought during that time period, but other things were happening as well. We had disastrous wheat pricing as a result of the market crash in 1932. We had grasshoppers stretched through the prairie provinces in 1933, really affecting wheat production. In 1935, we had wheat rust and we had frost. Wheat rust in Saskatchewan and frost in Alberta, really impairing or impacting wheat production. We had low annual precipitation in 1937, one of the driest years on record. One of the other things Heather talked about was our agricultural farming practices weren't well adapted to the prairie provinces. And I call immigrant farmers, people that came from Europe, came from other places in the world to farm here, brought their farming practices to the prairie provinces, and they didn't work very well here, especially in really dry conditions. We also had a federal agency form up in the late 1930s, the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration, to address some of these issues that we saw in the dirty 30s in the prairie provinces. An interesting read is that report by E.W. Stapleford talking about what happened on the prairie provinces from 1930 to 1937. Next slide, please. So this is what we see. This is what the picture we see of the drought of the 1930s, no crops, soil moving, everything. But it was much more than just that was part of the issue. Next slide, please. The drought of the early 2000s, across Canada, the ag production dropped an estimated $3.6 billion, especially for 2001, 2002. In 2002, that number was more than $2 billion in Canada. The GDP, the Canadian GDP dropped by some $5.8 billion. Again, the larger loss was in 2002. Farm employment, jobs directly related to agriculture, dropped by 41,000 during that time period. There were net farm incomes which were negative or zero for several provinces. So there was a net farm income in the Prince Edward Island in 2001 and in Saskatchewan in 2002. Crop production losses were devastating across Canada. Livestock production was especially difficult due to scarcity of feed and water. And water supplies were impacted. Next slide, please. So we looked at climate change. We looked at 10 regional models. We had Dave Sachin with the University of Regina and Prairie Adaptive Research Collaborative pull together information on climate change. We used an RCP 8.5 scenario. Some of the information we found is on the next slide. South Saskatchewan River Basin, we see on an annual basis, from these 10 models, 3.2 or 3.3 degree temperature rise, and precipitation on an annual basis is increased by 10%. Next slide. But we saw in the summer, we see no change in precipitation, and we still see that same temperature rise. So we're going to see more evapotranspiration, and we're going to see more water use in the prairies under a climate change scenario. Next slide. So key points: precipitation will be highly variable. Winter snowpack is likely going to become less. We're going to see more freezing rain events. Summer storms are going to be more severe, and drought is probably going to be longer and more severe. Next slide, please. So through BRACE, we were able to work with communities to help develop drought response plans. 18 communities have been involved in this process. Next slide. So we had a 9-step process that we had to learn going through this process. We invited communities to participate. We identified what drought was and what climate change will mean to them. We gathered information on water supply and water treatment and worked with communities to identify their risks and concerns associated with drought. We developed a couple of tools, a workbook and an Excel file to help them figure out what drought will look like. And we started to work with communities on what a drought response plan would look like, including the responsibilities of the community, their mutual aid areas, how we're going to deal with the drought from provincial agency perspective, and also federal government. We need to work with them to identify their specific actions in their drought response plan, develop an organization to deal with drought, help them do that, develop community-driven actions and activities, their physical action plan in their drought response plan, and then help them develop communication activities in the plan, both with their own residents, with the mutual aid areas, and with the other levels of government. Next slide, please. We never want to go back to this situation where people are leaving the prairie provinces. This was an image that was quite common in southern Saskatchewan, people moving to the north. Next slide, please. I want to acknowledge the partners that we had in our process. Obviously, Natural Resources Canada through the BRACE funding, Prairie Adaptive Research Collaborative, the Saskatchewan Research Council, Prairie Water out of the University of Saskatchewan, the municipalities of Saskatchewan, SUMA, the urban municipalities, and also the Public Safety Agency in the province, who are strong partners in this thing. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Doug. Maybe just a quick clarification question before moving to our last presentation for Doug and Heather. So someone was asking, how long has the Water Security Agency of Saskatchewan been active? So I think that's a quick reply that we can address now.
Good question, great question. I was going to say it's probably 11 years now, 2010, 2011, we formed up, but we came together initially as an organization about 2003, and then added on responsibilities in 2010, 11.
Okay, thanks, Doug. So we'll move to our final presentation. It's going to be from CBCL, who will talk to us about incorporating climate change consideration into water and wastewater guidelines. So we'll have two presenters. Lindsay Bolton is a registered professional engineer specializing in climate change adaptation, flood mitigation, combined sewer analysis, stakeholder consultation, as well as hydrologic and hydraulic analysis and design. Lindsay has been involved in and managed a variety of projects, such as adaptation planning for municipality, flood risk and vulnerability mapping, flood risk assessments for municipal infrastructure, hydrologic and hydraulic analysis for stormwater management projects. And we also have with us Amy Winchester, who has over 18 years experience as a process environmental engineer. She's a registered professional engineer working for the St. John office of the CBCL Limited. since starting with the firm in 2004, Amy has worked on a diverse range of projects, including water distribution master planning and modeling, asset management, climate change risk assessments, and environmental assessments as well. So I think, Amy, you're starting?
I am,
yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Dominic. So yeah, we're going to talk about the Atlantic Canada Water Wastewater Guidelines, which Lindsay and I have been part of for the last few years. I have to thank my predecessor, Willa Dion, who did a good amount of the project management and the work for the first little bit. And as he is enjoying retirement, I took over. So just changing screens. There we go. Before I get into it, though, I just want to say Lindsay and I are both joining from the St. John area, and we wanted to acknowledge that this land, and we recognize as a traditional unceded territory of the Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq people, and that's the beautiful Wolastoqey River that you see there in a shot of St. John. And the territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which the Wolastoqey, Mi'kmaq people, and Passamaquoddy people signed with the British peoples in many years ago, and we're very fortunate to be here enjoying the beautiful area. So next slide. I am going to just do a little bit of an introduction to the project, and then you can see lessons learned as well. We'll switch over and Lindsay will jump in. Like I said, very long project, a lot of people involved, and but today I believe we're going to focus really on the climate piece and some of the stuff that came out of that. But if there's anything that people have as questions generally that I don't cover today, then please feel free to reach out. The next slide. Obviously, this project was funded by Prairies, which we're appreciative of. But in addition to that, it was quite it takes a village, I guess. The Atlantic Canada Water and Wastewater Association recognized that the guidelines that have been in place and used quite widely in Atlantic Canada, one of them was last published in 2004 and the other one was last published in 2006. So in general, the guidelines, were out of date, but also there was very little information, if any at all, related to climate change. And so a few years ago, some of the folks on the board, as we're talking, and realized there's some risks within there. And so they went and they talked to the provinces, PEI, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. All the provinces provided both either cash funding and or in-kind support, because we didn't want the guidelines to be updated without the input from the provincial representatives. City of Charlottetown and the City of Halifax as well provided a huge amount of time and effort and resources to it. And the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority, we're fortunate to have them represented as well, which came from one of our representatives at the province of Nova Scotia, switched to go there a couple of years ago. So we also had them on our team. So a lot of people working on these. You can go to the next slide. So the project had two major objectives. Like I said, we're going to focus on the second one, but one of the objectives was to update the guidelines. So, if anybody wants some information on that, that was a job in itself, where the documents were from 2004 and 2006. But the other one that Lindsay will focus on here was how do we incorporate climate resilience into the planning process, the design, the operations of water and wastewater infrastructure. Next slide. It's really, really high level overview. To take a couple of documents, each that are hundreds of pages long, there were initial reviews by steering committee and technical committee internally, where we flagged items that needed to be updated. We released that, so it's been released to the public. There was a lot done on the stakeholder engagement. And as the others have mentioned, a big part of our stakeholder engagement included a lot of in-person workshops. We were tagging along to some workshops and conferences, or that was part of the plan anyway, that we would add a day where we'd have workshops and get people together and get their comments and facilitate it. But really 2019 was the only one that we're able to have, because come 2020, all the in-person events stopped. So a little bit of rejigging things and talking, but we just had to become more creative. That I imagine everybody did. So the online platform was used quite heavily. So we had sessions that were offered through ACWWA. We presented not only at those conferences, but also we reached out to find other conferences where there'd be some folks that might have some input on the guidelines. And through our network, we ended up doing quite a few extra webinars, virtual presentations, and then as well soliciting comments. We had a knowledge portal that was set up online so that folks could go in both see different documentation. So the guidelines are made up of a series of other guidelines and regulations and documents that are released. So copies of those were available. And the knowledge platform also helped us to keep track of what the level of interest were. So there was quite a lot of interest, both in the guidelines themselves, as well as the supporting documentation that we used as reference material. I can go to the next one. This is just a quick one. So these guidelines are available on the ACWWA website. They were released in May 2022. We also, the guidelines, the way they were set up the first time around, were issued. This time around, what we wanted to do was set up some tracking availability so that if there are comments, they're large documents, there's now an ability for those comments to get tracked, changed periodically, and documented so that the information can try to be updated a little more frequently than every 15 years. Next slide. Well, that's the tracking sheet at it, yeah. I won't get in too much to this, but just some notes in terms of the guidelines that the guidelines are set up for those of you that aren't from the Atlantic Canada area. A lot of you, if you are working in Atlantic Canada area and water and wastewater, you probably would be familiar with these guidelines. But we tried to, they're essentially information used that it's pulling from other sources of data available, but with the focus on what things would be most likely to happen in Atlantic Canada, maybe things that aren't as likely. And we didn't want to make them province specific. There was some wording in it before that might point you to a specific provincial rule, which we're trying to get away from. Updated the language for consistency, new references, there's new standards that are out there. So that's just kind of the general updates. And then with the next slide, wanted to focus where in addition to the climate change and climate resilience, which Lindsay will get into, it's probably more the bulk of this presentation, but we did do a whole new section on corrosion control in the harmful algae blooms. So I'll just say a couple of things on those two, and then I'm going to switch it over to Lindsay. So from corrosion control, I'm sure you've heard about problems with lead in water. So it's been something that's always been around, but there's been more focus on it in the last few years. And so the guideline, which would have been mid-2000s that it was done, had a little bit of lead control in it, but now it's been backed up in this guidelines with a lot more guidance, obviously review of all the best practices, provincial regulations, but then some more discussion on treatment considerations as well as monitoring considerations and how you should design those programs. Let's switch to the next one. And similarly, as we know, that folks are having more and more issue with now are the cyanobacteria and the harmful algae blooms. Around here, we've actually had some cases of it close to water systems, which is a big concern from the old way of just boil your water and maybe don't brush your teeth with the water to do not consume notices. So there's a lot of work going on in there. There's still not figured out completely, but now there's some more guidance in this document related to this topic. So I went through all of this really fast. You can switch the slide. I'll turn it to Lindsay. But like I said, if there's anything in there that you're interested in, I could certainly answer those questions.
Thanks, Amy.
Thanks.
So like Amy mentioned, I'm going to talk on a few slides here on specifically the addition of the climate change chapter. Amy mentioned before, we added a climate change chapter to each of the two documents, as well as many other changes and updates that went into both of the guidelines, but I'm going to be talking specifically about the climate change chapter. So just for clarity, the climate change chapter I'm referring to is on climate resilience specifically, not mitigation, not greenhouse gases, not net zero. Anything related to those type of climate mitigation initiatives are not what I'm going to be talking about. I'm referring to climate resilience specifically. So some of the additions that we added: consistency of language around climate change, parameters, indices, type of words like this, impacts, vulnerabilities. Just make sure that they're consistent across the entire document and that they're well defined. We provided a qualitative description of relevant climate parameters and trends for Atlantic Canada. And I say qualitative specifically because one of the requests that we got in a number of the stakeholder sessions is around providing specific projections in the document. And we, as Amy mentioned before, it could be a number of years before this document is updated and republished. It's not meant to be a living document that's consistently updated. So as projections change, as we get new information, we knew that it wasn't going to be possible to maintain a document that was relevant with new projections information. So we talked about general trends, what type of climate parameters are relevant in Atlantic Canada to include in any type of climate change assessment, but we didn't provide very specific projections and timeframes that you could just grab out of the document and use to keep the document relevant over all time periods. So we also discussed typical infrastructure interactions with climate change impact interactions. We also looked at water quality and environmental impacts we discussed as well in the document. We made note of relevant standards today, kind of overarching standards that we don't think will become or that we believe will be used in the longer term, ISO, for example. And overall, I've wrapped this up by saying it's just a rapidly changing science, both climate projection science and risk and adaptation. So we wanted to keep this document relevant over time and not something that had to be consistently updated. And for that reason, we were very specific about the language we used and about our approach to the addition of the chapter. I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. So in terms of how we dealt with the climate information / projections and data, we chose to incorporate as much up-to-date information as possible. The information was changing even over the 2 years that we were updating the document. So that shows you how quickly data and best practices are evolving. We provided a section on how to read, interpret, manage, and find climate data, how to deal with uncertainty, how to apply it in an engineering context or to a risk assessment. So we focused on the process of using climate information rather than presenting the climate information and saying, just now you grab it. It's more, this is where you find climate information. This is how you interpret it. This is how you manage it. And here's a process for using it. We also talked not just about climate projections and data, but also Indigenous knowledge, operator experience, and other sources of information that's relevant to a climate risk assessment. And like I mentioned before, instead of links to data portals that exist today that are relevant today that may not be used in the future, we just provided examples and also a section on best practices for obtaining the information and what level of detail would be appropriate for different types of assessments. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of risk assessments, so now we're applying the climate information to a risk and vulnerability assessment. We provided tools and best practices for completing them. We specified the difference between completing a risk assessment on an existing piece of infrastructure versus a proposed new addition or an upgrade, a retrofit. So applying risk assessments to something that is being designed at different levels of design. We also talk about the fact that risk is relative to the owner's risk tolerance. So we have very different size utilities and municipalities across Atlantic Canada, and we had to provide a process that was relevant for all of those different sizes. And in terms of recommendations, we did provide some examples of impacts of climate change that would be applicable in a risk assessment, what level of detail would be required depending on the output that you want, and when in the design process a risk assessment is relevant. And we also have a description of impact models. So what I mean by this is developing, for example, flood mapping or flood modeling, sewer models, things like that to understand flood risk and capacity of infrastructure, which might be taking your assessment to another level if that's the type of results that you need that may go outside of an overarching climate change risk assessment. And next slide. Okay, so I mentioned different types of risk assessments. So for example, we talk about the use of a climate lens that Infrastructure Canada's approach, but we also talk about using screening level assessments at the pre-consultation phase of a project, as well as all going into a full risk assessment at a pre-design phase, and then doing an overarching risk assessment for existing assets, everything from a certain asset class, like my dams, for example, to completing a risk assessment, a utility or municipality wide. So we talk about all those different scopes and scales of assessments and how they could be tackled. And we also discuss climate change adaptation planning, typical adaptation measures that would be relevant in Atlantic Canada. Of course, these are highly project specific, so we focused again on the approach to planning for adaptation and how to do return on investment calculations in order to support your preferred adaptation approach. Okay. And I'll pass it over to Dominique. Perfect. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all for the very informative presentations. We now, let me look at the time, we now have about 9 minutes left for the Q&A period. So if you have any questions or comments, now it's the time to add them in the Q&A box. And of course, if we're not able to get to all of them today, we'll follow up after by email. So I invite now the presenters to put their camera back on. So Amy, Doug, Heather, and Lindsay, if you want to put your camera back on. So excellent, thank you. So we have a question here, Heather, there's a few questions for you. We'll start with the first one. What was the Association of Landscape Architects consulted during your project?
We did not bring the landscape architects into it, no. We have, with our qualified persons, we worked with 3 professional associations, including APEG, so Association of Professional Engineers and Geoscientists, Society or Institute of Saskatchewan Institute of Agrologists and Technology Professionals of Saskatchewan.
Okay, thank you. I have also a question here for all. So could you highlight one key message or learning from your projects that are transferable to other organizations or region, which would be interested in building adaptation skills for water management? Who wants to start?
Yeah, I don't mind starting.
Good.
I don't mind starting. One of the things we found with the communities that we were dealing with, and our community sizes went from 50 to 20,000 people. They didn't have a really good understanding of where their water was coming from. Didn't have a really good understanding of what their water treatment, waste treatment processes were actually there. So they relied an awful lot on our environmental protection officers to supply information in that kind of area. And I really think that, you know, that municipalities need to take a step back and understand what they have and manage their own works. And that goes not so much from the people that are directly involved in the process, the treatment plant operators and that kind of thing, but actually the politicians and the administration side of things. So, you know, just some things that we learned.
Heather, Amy, or Lindsay, anything, any lessons learned or key aspect of your project? Yeah, Heather?
Yeah, I'll step in. I think stakeholder engagement is key, as well as we need to bring in these different organizations to consult, discuss, understand things better.
Yep, great, thanks. Anything to add, Amy, Lindsay? Oh,
yeah. The only guidance that I have, and from my perspective, it's more on that we updated the guideline documents, where we had to deal with a wealth of information that came in. And we had a lot of discussions on what information do we keep, what do we change. It's really easy to get caught in somebody said we should do this, so let's just do it. So we really had to develop a set of criteria ahead of time and stick to them for our methodology of when we make a change, and be able to defend that change as we keep going.
Great, thanks, Amy. And while you're on the screen, there's a question here about the guidelines. Are the guideline documents meant to be just a resource for engineers, or does it have a legislative context requiring its uptake and use?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we actually talked about this quite a bit. So from ACWA's perspective, these are guidelines. They're not requirements. They're not legislation. Where from my experience, where I've seen them is I do see, you'll find, not from a provincial point of view of saying you shall follow these guidelines. In fact, it'd be the opposite. The guidelines would say you shall follow the applicable jurisdictions, rules, and regulations. You'll find them referenced in technical specifications for construction as guidelines that you should go follow, but we actually went through the document and we made changes like take out the word shall and put the word should, because we wanted to be very careful that these are not mandated by law. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Good. Thanks, Amy. We only have 3 minutes left, so maybe one more question. Heather, I have a question here for you. What are I don't know if you'll be able to answer, but let's see about the cost. What are the increased costs of adapting a drainage solution for climate change, and the benefits versus the cost of adaptation action, as the liability and associated costs seem high? So that's quite a specific question. So
yeah, no, it totally is. I know that we've had a number of, I'm going to go a little bit into a different program that we developed called our flood reduction program. And really what we've found is that often if you can look to adapt and help communities develop programs that can prevent them from flooding before it happens, so looking at that risk assessment process, you can reduce the costs a lot. So I think really that's what we're trying to do with agriculture as well, as we're trying to work with the community individuals in a network setting where we're looking at cumulative impacts and trying to reduce some of those impacts from drainage. And in so doing, we're hopefully reducing the costs and increasing the production.
good, thanks, Heather. There's only 2 minutes left, so we'll leave it there for the question. But again, we'll provide answer in the follow-up email that we'll send to everyone with the slide deck, and we'll provide answers to the questions that were not answered today. So no worry, everybody will see the responses. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, including, of course, our 4 presenters. We included here on this slide a few references, and we would appreciate if you go to the other slide, if you could take a minute to fill an evaluation form. The link has been added to the chat, and it will also be included in the copy of the slide that you will receive post-webinar. So we welcome, of course, any comments to help us improve the upcoming webinar. And talking of upcoming webinar, the next one will focus on building adaptation capacity in economic sectors, and it will be held on December 1st. Registration information will be shared shortly. So on this note, I thank you all for attending. Thank you again for our presenters. Merci à tous, and I wish you a very nice afternoon. And I hope you can join us for the other webinars. Thank you all.